There is a particular kind of thought that tends to arrive uninvited in the quieter hours of life. Not a panic, not a crisis, something smaller and softer than that. It comes when you are driving alone and an old song plays on the radio. It comes when you are sorting through a drawer and find a photograph you had forgotten was there. It comes at dinner, when the house is quieter than you expected, and you find yourself thinking about someone you have not spoken to in years. Someone who is no longer easy to reach, or no longer here at all. It is not quite sadness. It is not quite pain in the sharp sense. It is more like a shadow, a gentle awareness that your life has taken a particular shape, and that shape is now permanent in ways it was not before. That certain things have closed behind you. That certain words were never said, and the person they were meant for has moved on or moved away or is simply gone. This feeling is one of the most common and least discussed experiences of the second half of life. People in their 50s, 60s, and 70s are old enough to look back at a substantial portion of what they have lived, and to notice the distance between the life they imagined and the life they actually built. That distance, that quiet gap, has a name. But it is rarely named plainly, and even more rarely spoken about honestly. We call it regret, and most people carry it quietly, without much language for it, and without many places to bring it. There is a reason for that. The culture we live in has very little patience for regret. There are entire philosophies built around the idea that regret is weakness, that a well-lived life has no room for looking backward, that healthy people move on, let go, and keep their eyes fixed on what is still ahead. No regrets has become a kind of moral aspiration, a tattoo, a phrase on a graduation card, a thing people say with conviction at the end of a speech. But for many people, that instruction does not match what actually happens inside a full human life. Most people, if they are honest, if they are given the space to be honest, carry some regret. Not because they made terrible choices. Not because their lives were failures, but because living fully means making choices. Choosing this path means not walking that one. Choosing this job means not doing something else. Choosing this version of safety means letting something riskier pass by. And over 40 years, those choices accumulate. At some point, you begin to see their shape. The question is not whether you carry regret. Almost everyone does, to some degree. The question is what kind it is, and what it is actually trying to tell you, and whether it has to feel like a burden, or whether it can feel like something more useful. Today, we are going to talk about what people actually regret most in the second half of life. We are going to look at what researchers have found when they ask these questions, because the answers are both surprising and deeply human. We are going to think about why certain regrets are so common, what they reveal about the lives people have built, and whether regret has to feel like a weight pressed against the chest, or whether it can feel like something else. A map of what still matters, and a quiet signal about how to spend the time that remains. This will not be a conversation about guilt. It will not offer easy consolations or false assurances. It will be an honest look at one of the quieter truths of later life, the kind of truth that many people sense but rarely have the chance to examine openly. Because understanding what you regret, clearly, without shame, without defense, is not a step backward. It is one of the most useful things a person can do. To understand why certain regrets are so common, it helps to understand the world people were preparing for, and the world that actually arrived. Most people who are now in their 50s, 60s, or 70s grew up in a culture built around a very specific set of promises. The deal, as it was understood, went something like this: work hard, be responsible, be reliable, sacrifice what is unnecessary, build security, and eventually life will reward you. Stability will arrive, there will be time, the good part will come. This was not just personal philosophy. It was the operating system of entire generations. It shaped how people thought about career decisions, how they spent their weekdays, how they weighed what mattered against what could wait. The future was where the good things lived. Retirement was the destination. Someday was the plan. And so people got to work. They took the safer job over the more interesting one, because the safer job paid more and the family needed the income. They stayed in cities they did not love because the career was established there and moving felt too disruptive. They worked long hours because the mortgage was real, because the school fees were real, because the sense that more security was needed never quite went away. They told themselves that the marriage could receive the attention it deserved once things settled down, once the children were older, once the next promotion came through, once the debt was cleared. They told themselves they would call their parents more often when things were less hectic. They told themselves they would find time for the old friendship, the creative pursuit, the honest conversation, later. The trouble with later is that it arrives differently than planned. It arrives after things have already changed in ways that cannot be reversed. Some people discover that by the time they reach the quieter years they were working toward, the relationships have shifted in ways they did not expect. The children grew up and moved to other cities and built their own lives, and the closeness that had been assumed, the warmth that was supposed to settle in during retirement, is more distant than imagined. Not because anyone chose distance, but because the years of partial presence added up. Because the children grew accustomed to a certain kind of relationship, and that kind of relationship became the template. Some people discover that the parents they were going to visit more often are no longer alive. That there were 5 more years of visits possible, and they used 2 of them. Some people discover that the friend they kept meaning to call found their own version of a busy life, and the connection thinned out over years. Not because of any falling out, not because of any disagreement, but because connection requires tending, and neither person made the time to tend it. Until one day the friendship was simply gone. Not ended, just quietly absent, the way warmth leaves a room when the fire goes out and no one notices for a while. Some people discover that they spent so long managing the practical dimensions of life, the bills, the schedules, the logistics, the 1,000 small obligations that constitute a responsible adult existence, that the interior of their marriage, their friendships, their own sense of who they were, quietly eroded while they were not paying attention. Not dramatically, just slowly, the way things erode when they are not maintained. It is important to say clearly, this is not a story about failure. Most of these people made reasonable choices given what they knew and what they faced. The pressures were real, the financial obligations were real, the desire to protect one's family was genuine. The fear that security would collapse if they let their guard down was not irrational. For many people, it was based on genuine experience. But the culture they lived in was not particularly good at reminding them what was also real. That time moves in one direction. That relationships require presence and cannot survive indefinitely on good intentions. That safety and meaning are not the same thing. That the things most worth having in a life often require a willingness to accept some discomfort in the present, rather than always waiting for a safer or more convenient moment. What changed between the world people expected and the world they found is not only economics, not only technology, not only the structure of the family. What changed is simpler and harder to name. The some days ran out. And the life that had been quietly deferred turned out not to have a later. Understanding that is not about regret as blame. It is about regret as context, about seeing clearly why so many people, who lived responsibly and tried to do right by the people they loved, still find themselves in the second half of life with this quiet weight. Not because they were selfish or careless, but because they were operating inside a system that told them the important thing was to build the future, and that the present could wait. In 2004, a palliative care nurse named Bronnie Ware began spending time with people who were dying. She sat with them in the final weeks and months of their lives, listening as they reflected on what they had lived. And she noticed patterns. The most common regret she heard was not about money. It was not about missed professional opportunities, or career mistakes, or financial decisions that went wrong. The most common regret was this: I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, rather than the life others expected of me. Many of the people she sat with had spent their lives managing what other people needed from them, their employers, their parents, their communities, their children's expectations of what a parent should be. And at the end, With the time and quietness that illness and proximity to death provide, they could see that they had never quite fully arrived at their own life. They had lived it, worked through it, managed it, been responsible within it, but had never lived it quite as themselves. The second most common regret she heard was, "I wish I had not worked so hard." Not "I wish I had worked more cleverly, or earned more, or been promoted more quickly." Simply, "I wish I had not worked so hard." The implication is clear enough. Not that work was wrong, but that the ratio was wrong, that the hours given to work came at the cost of something else that turned out, from the other side of a life, to matter more. These were not rare sentiments limited to particular kinds of people. They were consistent across individuals who had lived very different lives, different jobs, different families, different amounts of money, different parts of the world. What they shared was a recognition, in the final clarity of life, that they had spent a large portion of their years on things that ultimately did not feel like the point. Researchers at Cornell University, in a series of studies on regret conducted over many years, found something that complements what Ware observed. When people are young, they tend to regret actions, things they did that they wished they had not done. A harsh word spoken in anger. A relationship ended impulsively. A decision made without enough thought. But as people age, the balance shifts. Older people more often regret inactions. The things they did not do, the words they did not say, the risks they declined, the paths they chose not to walk. And the content of those regrets follows a clear pattern. The most durable regrets, the ones that remain painful across decades, are almost always about relationships and identity. About connection, about honest speech, about the sense of having been present or absent in one's own life. Not about money, not about possessions, not about the car, the house, the vacation, the promotion. Think of what that actually looks like in ordinary life. It looks like a person who spent 40 years in a marriage that slowly became more arrangement than intimacy. Who managed the household, showed up, provided, was technically there, but never found a way to say what was actually true about who they were or what they needed. Who reached the other side of the marriage either alone or still technically together, but aware of a distance that was never crossed when crossing it was still possible. It looks like someone who drifted from their adult children during the years those children most needed something other than provision. Who kept showing up as a provider, the one who paid, who organized, who planned, but not quite as a person. And who now finds that closeness is harder to create than it would have been to maintain. It looks like a person who had a friendship that sustained them for decades, but who allowed it to thin out through neglect, through the accumulated weight of missed calls and rescheduled visits and let me know when things are less busy on both sides. Until one day the friend was simply no longer close. Not because of a fight, not because of a rupture, because life had quietly moved on without the friendship being tended. And now one of them has died, or moved far away, or simply become a stranger wrapped in old familiarity. It looks like someone who worked in a field that was safe and reliable and respectable, and who told themselves for 30 years that they were being practical, being responsible, doing the right thing. And who reaches the other side of that decision feeling both financially secure and strangely like a stranger to themselves. Like someone who got very good at performing a role but who never quite had time to find out who they were when no one was watching. These are not dramatic stories. There is no villain. There is no catastrophic mistake. There are only the accumulated choices of ordinary days, the small prioritizations, the reasonable postponements, the sensible decisions, that over time produced a life that, from the inside, feels slightly off from what the person actually wanted. That is what makes this kind of regret so hard to talk about. It is not a clear mistake. It is a slow drift. And by the time you see it clearly enough to name it, the years that accumulated it are already behind you. There is also a particular cruelty in the way this kind of regret operates, which is that the very qualities that produced it often looked like virtues at the time. Being responsible, being reliable, not making unnecessary trouble, not asking for too much, not insisting on things when there were more important considerations at hand. These are not small virtues. They are genuinely good qualities, and the people who cultivated them were often doing so because they understood something real about what it means to care for others and to take life seriously. The problem is that those same qualities, practiced without enough awareness of what they were costing, quietly accumulated into something else. The reliable person became the person no one really knew. The responsible person became the person who was always managing and never quite present. The person who never asked for too much became the person who, at the end of a long life, is not sure anyone ever knew what they actually needed or who they actually were. This is perhaps the hardest thing to hold about this particular kind of regret. It does not emerge from selfishness or carelessness. It emerges, very often, from genuine love, from the desire to protect others, to provide for others, to not burden others with one's own needs and desires. And that good intention, carried a little too far across too many years, can produce a life that, from the inside, feels quietly incomplete. Here is what I think is the most important thing about regret that our culture tends to get wrong. We treat regret as a sign of failure, as evidence of weakness, poor planning, inadequate resilience, or insufficient gratitude. We tell people to move on, let go, forgive themselves, focus on the positive. We construct entire philosophies around the idea that looking backward is a kind of defeat. And while some of those instructions are not entirely wrong, guilt and rumination are genuinely destructive when they go on long enough. They often have the effect of silencing something that deserves to be heard. Because regret is not primarily a sign of failure. Regret is a signal about values. When you regret not having spent more time with your children, you are not revealing that you were a bad parent. You are revealing that connection with your children mattered deeply to you, perhaps more deeply than you were able to act on during the years when it was most possible. The regret is the echo of the value. It would not hurt if it did not matter. When you regret not having spoken more honestly in a marriage, not having said what was actually true about who you were and what you needed, you are not revealing that you were a coward. You are revealing that honesty and intimacy were things you genuinely wanted. That the life you were building was supposed to include them. The regret is not a judgment. It is a memory of desire. When you regret not having taken a particular risk, a different career, a creative pursuit, a more honest way of being in the world, you are not revealing that you were timid. You are revealing that something in you wanted that kind of life. That the wanting was real, even when the choosing felt too frightening, or too costly, or too disruptive of the stability others depended on. Understood this way, regret is not an accusation. It is a message. It tells you what actually mattered to you, underneath the responsibilities and the obligations and the reasonable choices. It tells you what kind of life your deeper self was oriented toward, even when the surface of your life moved in other directions for practical and understandable reasons. This distinction matters enormously, because the way you understand your regret determines what you can do with it. If you understand it as failure, as proof that you made the wrong choices, that you were insufficient in some fundamental way, the only responses available are guilt, shame, or denial. You either punish yourself for having built a life that fell short of what you wanted, or you defend yourself against the feeling by insisting everything was fine. Anyone would have done the same. You had no choice. There was no other way. Neither of those responses actually helps. Guilt does not repair a drifted friendship. Denial does not create presence in a relationship that lacked it. And both close off the possibility of doing anything differently with what remains. But if you understand regret as information, as a quiet, honest signal about what you were actually made for, then something different becomes possible. You can sit with the feeling long enough to hear what it is saying. You can ask, given that this is what I regret, and given that I still have years ahead of me, what would it mean to live in closer alignment with what I actually value? Not with guilt driving that question, but with clarity. With the kind of honest self-knowledge that a full life, reviewed clearly, can provide. It is also worth noting that regret is not distributed equally across all areas of life. People do not tend to regret the size of their house, or the car they drove, or most of the purchases they made. Material regrets are real, but they tend to be shallow. They do not persist with the same intensity across decades. What persists, what continues to carry weight across years and even across the whole of a life, is almost always relational and existential. It is always about people, about connection, about honest speech, and about whether the person inside, the one who wanted and feared and hoped, was ever fully seen, even by the people who claimed to be closest. This is important to understand because it is not at all what the culture tells us to prioritize. The culture is very good at talking about success, about achievement, about wealth and security and the appearance of a life well managed. It is not particularly good at talking about presence, about the value of being genuinely, attentively here, in a conversation, in a room, in a relationship, rather than efficient and capable and always slightly elsewhere. And so people spend decades inside a culture that measures them primarily by their output, by what they produce and provide and achieve, and arrive at the end of those decades to discover that what they actually regret is almost entirely about the interior of their life, about whether they were there, whether they were honest, whether they were themselves. There is another distinction worth making here, because researchers on regret have found it to be important. The difference between regret of action and regret of inaction. When we are young, as I mentioned, we tend to regret things we did. The relationship we ended poorly, the job we left impulsively, the words we said in a difficult moment. These are painful, but they tend to fade over time. There is something about completed actions, even ones we wish had gone differently, that the mind eventually metabolizes. We tell ourselves the story of what happened, we understand it in context, we find ways to make meaning of it, and the sharpness of the regret dulls. Not disappears, but softens into something more like a lesson, or a scar, than an open wound. But inactions do not fade in the same way. The things we did not do, the conversations we never had, the risks we never took, the paths we turned away from, tend to remain raw in a different way. Because they do not have an ending. The conversation never happened, so it stays as a possibility that was never explored. It stays open, and as time passes, the window for it closes, and the openness becomes a kind of permanent incompleteness. The risk was never taken, so the question of what might have happened remains unanswered. Not answered wrongly, unanswered. And unanswered questions tend to haunt differently than answered ones. This is why the deepest regrets of later life are almost universally about inaction. Not about what people did wrong, but about what they did not do. The presence that was withheld, the words that were not spoken, the risks that were declined in favor of something smaller and safer. There is something in this that runs counter to the culture of caution that many people were raised in. We were taught that the safe choice is almost always wiser. That waiting is prudent, that restraint is responsible, that you do not say the difficult thing if the timing is not right, and the timing is rarely quite right. That you do not take the risk if the outcome is uncertain, and the outcome is always uncertain. And in some domains, financial, professional, legal, that is genuinely good advice. Caution in those areas prevents real harm. But in the domain of relationships, of honest speech, of living in closer alignment with what you actually are, caution often produces the opposite of safety. It produces distance. It produces the gradual accumulation of things unsaid and presence withheld. It produces the life that, from the outside, looks responsible and correct and managed, but that from the inside carries the quiet weight of never having quite arrived. There is also something worth saying about the culture of positivity that surrounds these conversations. The no regrets philosophy, which sounds liberating, which sounds like a kind of freedom, often functions as a way to avoid sitting with something real and important. To say I have no regrets can mean, I have learned from everything, I have grown through difficulty, I am at peace with the life I lived. That is a genuine form of wisdom when it is true. But it can also mean, I have decided not to look too closely at the gap between the life I wanted and the life I built. I would rather feel resolved than feel the discomfort of seeing things clearly. I prefer the comfort of the phrase to the honesty of what is actually there. The second version is not wisdom. It is a form of avoidance that carries its own cost. It prevents you from hearing what your regrets are trying to tell you, which means it prevents you from doing anything differently in the years that remain. The feeling gets sealed over. The information goes unread, and the same patterns, the same deferrals, the same comfortable distances continue, not because they are chosen, but because nothing was ever clearly examined. The most honest and useful posture toward regret is neither to be consumed by it nor to refuse to look at it. It is to sit with it long enough to understand what it is actually saying. To let it be real without letting it become a verdict. To receive it as information about the life you were actually oriented toward, and to ask, from that more honest place, what you still want to do with the years you have left. So what do you do with regret once you understand it clearly? It is important to say this plainly, because false consolation would be its own kind of failure. Not everything can be repaired. That is simply true, and saying otherwise would not honor the intelligence of anyone sitting with this honestly. Some of the people you wished you had been closer to are no longer alive. The conversations that were delayed too long will not happen. Some relationships that drifted through years of neglect cannot be fully recovered, not because people are unwilling, but because the texture of closeness that accumulates through presence over time is not easily rebuilt once it has been absent for long enough. Some paths that were not taken are genuinely behind you now. The years that were spent in ways you now wish had been different cannot be relived. To pretend otherwise, to offer the reassurance that it is never too late, that everything can be made right with enough good intention, would be a disservice. It would be the kind of false comfort that sounds kind but leaves people less equipped to actually live in the truth of where they are. But this is also true, and it matters as much as the rest. The years that remain are real. And the understanding of what actually matters, which regret provides, painfully but honestly, is genuinely useful information for how to spend them. If you regret not having been more present with the people you love, you are not simply looking backward at something lost. You are receiving, in the form of a painful feeling, a clear piece of information about what to prioritize now. The children are adults. The relationship with them is different than it might have been. But it exists, and presence is still possible within it. The relationship you build now, at this stage, with the person they have become, is its own real thing. It is not the same as what you might have built if you had been more present in their childhood. But it is not nothing. And choosing presence now, even if it is late, is still a choice worth making. If you regret not having spoken more honestly, in a marriage, in a friendship, in your own understanding of yourself, you are not simply grieving a version of yourself that never quite showed up. You are learning something important about what you need in order to feel fully alive in a relationship. That knowledge is not useless now. The words that were never said may still have a place to be said. The honesty that was always deferred may still be possible, not in the same form, not with the same ease that earlier years might have allowed, but in some form. And even when a relationship is behind you, the understanding of what you need from one going forward is real and applicable. If you regret not having taken a certain risk, a creative direction, a different kind of work, a more honest way of being, you are not simply mourning a road not taken. You are discovering that something in you still wants to move in that direction. Not in the same form you imagined at 30, perhaps. But the underlying want, the desire for meaning, for expression, for a life that feels genuinely yours rather than performed for others' expectations, does not disappear just because years have passed. It waits. And there are ways of honoring it that do not require starting over, that do not require dramatic reinvention. Sometimes honoring it is smaller than that, more quiet, but real. The point, in the end, is this: regret is not the opposite of a well-lived life. It is a natural part of one. Anyone who has lived long enough to have made real choices will have things they wish had gone differently. That is not failure. That is the honest condition of a person who was alive, who wanted things, who cared about the shape of their existence. Indifference does not produce regret. Caring does. What matters is not the absence of regret. What matters is what you do with the understanding it offers. Regret, received honestly, not with excessive guilt, not with defensive denial, but with the quiet willingness to actually hear what it is saying, is a form of self-knowledge. It tells you what you were oriented toward beneath the noise and obligation of ordinary days. It tells you what you were made for, even when circumstances and fear and habit and the genuine weight of responsibility pulled you somewhere else. And that knowledge, held clearly, without shame and without performance, is one of the most honest and useful things a person can carry into the years that remain. Perhaps the wisest thing that can be said about regret is simply this: it proves that you had values. That you were not indifferent. That you cared about the texture of your life, and about the people in it, and about whether the person you were showing the world was actually the person you were. That something in you was always oriented toward meaning and connection and honesty, even when the surface of your life moved in other directions for reasons that were, at the time, entirely understandable. That is not a small thing to discover about yourself. It is, in fact, the beginning of something. The question is not how to erase what you regret. The question is how to let what you regret inform what you still have the chance to do. Not with urgency, not with guilt, not with the frantic quality of someone trying to make up for lost time. But with the quiet clarity of someone who finally knows, with some precision and some honesty, what actually mattered to them. And who still has years in which to live a little more in the direction of that knowledge. That, I think, is enough.